welcome to the very first edition of At Home With, a brand new series from the Essemmay Association, and I'm delighted to be joined this week into the home of former Director of Sixth Form at St Margaret's, John Foulkes MBE. He's been kind enough to allow us in to have an exclusive interview about his career and his life and times, and we're looking forward to finding out all about John's career and since his retirement as well. So firstly, John, tell us about your decision to become a teacher. How did that come about?
Well, it's something really that I always wanted to do, I think. So much so that when I finished my degree, I really began to question whether I should try something else just for a time. In the end, I decided not to. Decided it was really what I really wanted to do from a very young age, and I might as well follow my own star and follow my heart's desire, so to speak. So that's how it came about. Mm.
And so obviously following on from university, how did the job at St Margaret's come about? Was that your first job in teaching? Or
it was my first job in teaching. You could argue nobody else would have me afterwards, but there we are. Yes, it was my first job in teaching. Interestingly enough, I was at Leeds doing the PGCE, which I greatly enjoyed, and I was looking around for jobs and decided I would return to Liverpool. Live at home perhaps for a few years and then get my own place. And I looked around for jobs. A couple of jobs did come up in two very formerly prestigious schools in Liverpool. One I went to, I was greatly put off by the fact that someone had clearly held a brick through the headmaster's window. I didn't think that was very encouraging. And the second school I went to, I didn't see any children. They wouldn't let me see any pupils, so I was a bit put off by that as well. And I later found out that many of those teachers actually escaped to St Margaret's as the schools were changing in terms of their popularity and their prestige. So in the end, I had no job, and it came to about middle of June, and I don't know how I kept my nerve really, but I did. And I came across one day in one of the student common rooms a copy of what was called then the Grapevine. And the Grapevine was basically an advert newspaper, and I saw there an advert for a history teacher at St Margaret's High School in Liverpool. Mm-hmm. And so I applied for it, and lo and behold, within a few days, in fact, I had a telephone call from the headmaster, Mr. Naylor, inviting me to come for interview within a few days, in fact. I remember saying to him, I can't come on such and such a day. I've got the Gilbert and Sullivan show on, so can I come the day after? And I had no job. It was quite brave of me really to sort of take that line. Anyway, I went along and I met Mr. Naylor, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Mm. So in terms of, obviously, interviews nowadays are a rigorous process.
Yes.
What was the application process and the interview process like from your point of view?
Well, I think you could either argue they were so short of time to appoint someone, or I was terribly impressive. But in reality, I went along for the interview, had a chat with the headmaster, and then filled in the application form afterwards. So it was a very unorthodox way of being appointed. I believe that my predecessor, Mr. Pete Still, had decamped a blue coat at the very last minute of resignations, and so they were hoping to get an historian before September, and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and it suited both parties.
Mm. Very good. So did you have, obviously that was in the June-July time, was it?
It was, yes.
And then you moved. That was for a September
start.
For September. So were you living in Liverpool at that point, or were you moving?
I came back from Leeds after that, and the course had finished, and I'd had some social things to do, and I came back to Liverpool. Yes.
So did you know anyone at St Margaret's before you started?
Well, that's an interesting point. I didn't know anyone at St Margaret's as such, although when I arrived on my first morning to be greeted by Mr. Brophy, the head of history, there sitting over the table smiling at me was a certain John Ledger, who I had known at university, and he in fact had been appointed to teach economics. So in a sense that there was somebody there, yes, that I knew, and I was very surprised to see him, but also very pleased.
Mm. So how did you find the atmosphere in the school, so as a first impression, coming as an outsider into the new school?
Well, green, I think, describes me very well, actually, but certainly very friendly. Mr. Brophy was very supportive, very welcoming. I remember being greeted every morning as he sat with his pipe at the desk in the staff room with the morning wage slaves, which was his usual greeting. He was very supportive, very much keen to let me do my own thing, gave me some A-level teaching from the very beginning, in fact, which was in many ways a great declaration of trust to some extent. And the staff were very pleasant, very, very nice people indeed. Many of them, in fact, have been in teaching for many, many years, and they were very supportive and helpful. And yes, you got the sense that it was a very pleasant atmosphere.
So were you teaching from first year right the way through to the very top of upper sixth?
I wasn't teaching to upper sixth that particular time. Mr. Brophy took both the upper sixths, both the English history and the European. But yes, I was teaching right the way through the school, and indeed I had a second year, as it was called then, a year 8 class as you'd call it now, in room 15, and was thrown in the deep end there with my register and sent off to mark my register. Yes, they were a very nice group indeed, a very, very pleasant group of kids, they really were.
So you have fond memories of your very first lesson as a teacher?
Well, I remember the very first lesson, not in St Margaret's, but actually at Bradford Grammar School, where I did my teaching practice. Initially in Leeds, I was sent to a secondary modern school around the corner from where I had digs. Unfortunately, they only had a very small history department, a big geography department, but they couldn't really accommodate me. So whenever they got stuck at the university, they would send people off to BGS, to Bradford Grammar School, where of course you'd have to learn to cope with the incredibly boisterous corridor situation, some very, very bright kids indeed, and also learn to carve Technicolor trifle 12 ways as you presided over 12 boys at lunchtime, all waiting to be served by the master at the head of the table. I have never heard a Latin grace said so quickly. They could do it within seconds, and you would have this crash as all the cutlery rained down upon the tables. But that was a real experience. The very first class I taught, I can still see it now. Me stood at the front, and the head of department, who was a very nice chap, sat at the back. And he said at the end of the lesson, that was extremely good. The kids were really fascinated. He said, but you do realise you've gone through a month's history teaching in about 40 minutes, because I was so nervous. And I soon learned to calm down, so to speak. And obviously, you know, the preparation would have been impossible if I'd have gone at that pace. Although the kids, in fact, really quite enjoyed the lessons, particularly the lesson, I think, where we made Viking boats out of matchsticks, or was it lolly ice sticks, I forget now, and matchboxes, that's right. And we had a Viking fleet at the front of the class, which I set on fire for them. But there we are, that was they enjoyed that, yeah.
So you're obviously renowned for your enthusiastic style of teaching and sort of a very positive outlook.
Yeah.
Do you have any funny stories from your early days, sort of settling into St Margaret's in the classroom?
I don't know really. I think very early on there was a good dialogue between myself and the pupils, and I used to like to have breaks in the lessons, particularly if I had a double lesson, because in those days, of course, it was GCE, not GCSE. It was GCE. It was essays. And it was a lot of writing, a lot of work, and the pressure was on these youngsters, and so they appreciated, I think, a break in the lesson, and we'd have a conversation about something else, possibly when the bell went, if there was a double period particularly. But also there would come a time in the lesson when the cry would go up, toast, 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 and they would down pens, and I would then go round and collect what is now 5p from each of them, and I would then march off down to Mrs. Finn at the sixth form snack bar and bring back a huge platefuls of toast. So we had our toast break in the middle of the lesson. I'd like to say, though, for the record, officially, that in fact they did enjoy the lessons, and certainly they had an awful lot of homework from me, which they did without complaint, and I suspect that was because they had their toast quota quite regularly.
So obviously history is a very broad subject with lots to cover. What would you say is your favourite aspect of history to teach?
Well, I think to the younger ones, the Tudors is particularly interesting. I think Henry VIII's wives and Philip of Spain and the Armada, these colourful episodes, rather more difficult to try and get the Reformation across to them, I think. But for the younger ones, I think the Tudors, particularly, to get your teeth into. And for the older ones, I enjoyed the European history best, really, mainly 19th century. And in one way or another, I tended to specialise in aspects of that throughout the next 30 odd years, really, ending up, of course, with the famous course on Bismarck, which at the last minute was changed to the Kaiserreich 20 years further on, which just before I retired necessitated a huge amount of preparation, but still it was very rewarding and very interesting.
So how big was the history department when you first joined? How many staff were in that department at the time?
Oh, just the two of us.
Oh, really?
Just the two of us to start with, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. The school was much smaller.
Yeah.
The corridors weren't nearly so crowded, built for 400 pupils. Sixth form was growing, but it was relatively small. Didn't attract students from outside in any way in those days. So really we had, I think we had 3 forms of entry at that particular time. And of course, of the houses, Langton House didn't actually exist when I first arrived, and the Langton area, because the school was divided into 4 areas in its construction, Langton area was actually the sixth form centre, in fact. So it was quite small, quite an intimate and pleasant place. The only problem was that the architects and the clergy, I suspect, who had a big hand in designing the school, decided that they were going to have these huge form rooms, which were actually going to double up as house rooms. And so you virtually needed a megaphone to teach in massive classrooms with desks all sort of shoved in one corner and vast areas of space, which in the end Mr. Naylor, with his power tools, in fact, divided up into the classrooms that we see today.
Right. Interesting. So that concludes the first episode of At Home with John Foulkes. I'm delighted that we've been invited in. So thanks for your time today, John.
Thank you, Greg.
And we'll be back with episode 2 very shortly, and I'm sure there'll be more interesting tales of John's time at St Margaret's. Thank you.